Hey everyone, so today's topic is on three kinds of good arguments. So as a brief reminder, we're talking about arguments. Arguments have premises. Premises support the conclusion, which is the statement being argued for. And we're talking about how to analyze arguments. So there's three steps. We identify an argument, then we reconstruct the argument, and then we evaluate the argument. So right now we are talking about argument evaluation. And then within argument evaluation, there's two main steps. And so that's kind of where this PowerPoint is coming in. First, I'll review step one, and then most of today is going to be about step two. Okay, so step one of argument evaluation is what the last video was about, which is validity. So our first step is to determine if the argument is valid. And if it's valid, then the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But remember, this is only step one. And the reason this is only step one is because validity isn't all we need for an argument to be a good one. This is a valid argument. If the moon is purple, then God exists. The moon is purple, therefore God exists. But this is not a good argument for the existence of God. No one's going to be like, oh, I was an atheist, but then I heard this purple moon argument and now I believe in God, right? So even though it's valid, it's not a convincing argument. It doesn't give us a good reason to believe the conclusion. So this brings us to step two of argument evaluation. So once we determine that an argument is valid, then we're going to turn to looking at the premises themselves. So step two is evaluating an argument's premises. We need to determine validity first, and that's because if an argument isn't valid, it doesn't really matter either way if the premises are true, because they don't support the conclusion. Whether they're true or not, it doesn't really give us a reason to believe the conclusion. So first we need to make sure, okay, this is a valid argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion's true. And then we move on to looking at the argument's premises. Okay, this step is admittedly a little bit complicated though. And that's because there are several features of premises that can make an argument good in different ways. We're going to talk about three today. So are the premises true? Are the premises reasonable to believe? And then are the premises known? So if you are not familiar with or have forgotten the material from the videos on truth and the videos on rational belief, I would recommend going and looking at those. They are earlier in the playlist and just sort of refreshing yourself on what is truth, what is rational belief, and then we even talk a little bit about what knowledge is. And I also have a separate video about knowledge that I can also link in the description. But this video is going to be presupposing the material from those videos. So I think it's good to have that as kind of a fresh on your mind as a reminder. So this video is basically talking about these three ways that we can evaluate an argument's premises. Okay, so way one, or I guess type one of ways an argument can be good is what's called sound arguments. And in fact, in most critical thinking classes, they probably really just focus on sound arguments, but we're going to talk about reasons why sound arguments have limitations as well, and why we should think about these other two kinds of arguments too. So a sound argument is an argument that is valid and has true premises. And remember, truth is correspondence to the world. The purple moon argument isn't sound. The premises aren't true. They don't correspond to the world. Sadly, the moon is not purple. You know, that'd be awesome if it was, but it's not. But here is a sound argument. Dr. Jackson's over 21. If Dr. Jackson is over 21, then she can buy alcohol in the United States. Therefore, Dr. Jackson can buy alcohol in the United States. So this argument is valid and the premises are true, so it gives us a good reason to believe the conclusion. Remember, the purple moon argument had the same structure. It was valid, but because the premises were false, it didn't give us a good reason to believe the conclusion. However, sound arguments are limited in a very important way. And that's because we don't always have access to what's true and what's false. Sound arguments can have premises that are not supported by our evidence and not rational to believe, but just happen to be true. So here's an example. The number of hairs on my head is even. I have more than 2 hairs on my head, and that premise is true. I can prove it to you right now. If premises 1 and 2 are true, then the number of hairs on my head is not prime. Therefore, the number of hairs on my head is not prime. Okay, so this argument, as I've lost and gained hairs throughout my life, has been a sound argument at certain points in my life, and at certain points in my life, it's not a sound argument, just depending on kind of whether premise 1 is true and the number of hairs on my head is even or not. But because I'm never going to sit down and count the number of hairs on my head, I'm never going to know whether premise 1 is supported by my evidence or premise 1 is rational to believe. So this is sometimes a sound argument, sometimes not a sound argument. But because I don't have access to the truth of the premises, it's never going to give me a good reason to believe the conclusion. And so this is why sound arguments are limited. I mean, we want to get at the truth. The truth is important, but we just don't always have access to the truth. So that's kind of the limitation of sound arguments. So here's our first lesson. Even if an argument is sound, we still may have no reason to believe its conclusion or its premises. So sound arguments don't always give us a good reason to believe their conclusions. So this limitation brings us to type 2 of ways an argument can be good. And this is the type of argument that Feldman talks the most about. This is what Feldman calls strong arguments. So I'm just going to keep using Feldman's terminology here. A strong argument is valid and with premises that are reasonable to believe. So I'm going to use the word reasonable the same way that I use the word rational and the same way that I use the word justified. Roughly, I'm going to take all 3 of those to mean something roughly like supported by our evidence. So because the premises have to be reasonable to believe, this rules out the possibility that the premises are only true by luck. So it is true that many arguments are going to be both strong and sound. The drinking age argument is strong and sound because the premises are true and we also have good reason to believe the premises. But the argument about the number of hairs on my head, that's not going to be a strong argument, even if the premises are true, because the premises aren't reasonable for us to believe. We don't have evidence that supports the premise, especially the premise that says there's an even number of hairs on my head. And because of that, we aren't going to have a good reason to believe the conclusion. But here's what's interesting about strong arguments, and this is different than sound arguments. For strong arguments, the strength of an argument can vary from person to person, depending on what evidence they have or what evidence they have access to. I'll give an example in a second. I'm just going to talk about the second one too. And a strong argument can also vary for a single person over time. So I actually think children are a really good example of both of these facts. So an argument might be strong for you that isn't strong for a child because a child just doesn't have access to the same kind of evidence that you have. And same with you as a child versus you now. An argument might be strong for you now that wasn't strong for you as a child because as a child you just didn't have the evidence you have now. You could think about maybe an argument that you should vote a certain way or an argument for some political conclusion that probably wasn't strong for you as a child just because you didn't really have evidence about politics, evidence that the premises were true. It'd probably be even really hard for you to even understand the premises. But now it is strong for you because you have different evidence. So strength of arguments, again, can vary from person to person and can vary for a single person over time. And one thing that's really interesting about strong arguments is that often when defending an argument, we're going to give our audience evidence for the argument's premises. So we're going to have, let's say we have 3 premises. Part of what we do when defending that argument is give evidence or reasons to believe each premise. And what we're doing here is we're kind of ensuring that the argument is strong for them. So we're trying to give them evidence so the premises of that argument are reasonable for them to believe, and then assuming the argument's valid, they're going to have a reason to believe the conclusion. Okay, here's a really interesting kind of side note, but I think really interesting feature of strong arguments. And for strong arguments, the number of premises matters. And that's because really weird things start to happen when we have a very large number of premises. And here's one example. This is called the lottery paradox. And it's a paradox that philosophers talk about quite a bit. I think it's a really interesting paradox. So suppose we have a fair lottery with 100 tickets. Only one ticket will win, and it's fair. So each ticket has the same chance of winning. Given this setup, you could make the following argument. Premise one, ticket one will lose. That seems like it's supported by our evidence because there's, a 99% chance that it's true. Ticket two will lose. Again, seems like it's supported by our evidence, 99% chance that it's true. I'm not going to go through every one, but you get the point, all the way up until ticket 100 will lose. Again, each of these first 100 premises seems supported by our evidence. But if 1 through 100 is true, that means that no ticket will win because each ticket will lose. So from that, it follows that no ticket will win. And premises 1 through 100, again, they're well supported. Each is 0.99 likely to be true, and premise 101 seems right as well. But premise 102 is false because clearly one ticket will win. So this kind of illustrates the way that when we start to have like 100 premises, weird things happen. So the lesson from this is that for an argument to be strong, it should be reasonable to believe all the premises together, not just each premise individually. So you want to look at all the premises as a whole and say, are all these together reasonable to believe, not just looking at each premise individually, and then that can help us get out of these paradoxes like the lottery paradox. And this isn't going to come up a lot. This will mainly come up when you have an argument with tons and tons and tons of premises, but it is good to keep in mind. Okay. So even beyond that, though, there is a limitation of strong arguments. And that limitation is that strong arguments can have premises and conclusions that are false. So here's an example, and this example is about the NCAA March Madness tournament, which is a really big tournament that happens in the US every year. And teams are ranked 1 through 16. So the best teams are ranked number 1, and then the worst teams that barely make the tournament are ranked number 16. So in the 80 plus years of this tournament, a number 16 seed has never beat a number 1 seed. If premise 1 is true, then UMBC, which is a number 16 seed, will not beat Virginia, a number 1 seed. I forget exactly what year this was, but this was a couple years ago where UMBC, a number 16 seed, was playing Virginia, a number 1 seed. So conclusion, therefore, UMBC will not beat Virginia. And this seems, like, the premises seem, pretty good, given kind of our evidence, like, premise 1 is definitely true. Premise 2 also seems like it's pretty well supported by our evidence. And the issue is here isn't because there's like 100 premises or something. So, that's not the worry. But what happened was something totally unprecedented happened, something that was very unlikely given our evidence, and UMBC actually beat Virginia. And you can see from these pictures, how surprising it was. People were very, very surprised. It was a very big news story in sports for a very long time because of how unprecedented this was. So, before that game happened, this is a very strong argument. And I think most people that were predicting who would win picked Virginia just because of the reason given by premise 1, but that turned out to be false, and the conclusion turned out to be false. So this is an example of a strong argument, but it has a false conclusion because we had really misleading evidence. So this brings us to our third lesson. Strong arguments can have false premises and false conclusions. Okay, so before I jump into that, we've talked about strong arguments, we've talked about sound arguments. Sound arguments have true premises, but the problem is sometimes those premises aren't supported by our evidence, and so they don't give us a reason to believe the conclusion. And we've talked about strong arguments. Strong arguments have premises that are reasonable to believe, they're supported by our evidence, but the problem with strong arguments is that they can have false premises and false conclusions. And so both of these first two types of arguments have certain limitations. And so because of that, this brings us to a third way that an argument can be a good argument. And that's because it's what I'm calling a known argument. A known argument is valid and it has premises that are known to be true. And if you know that a premise is true, then that premise is true and it's reasonable to believe that premise. So known arguments kind of are take sound arguments and take strong arguments and sort of put them together. So maybe the very best kind of arguments are known arguments, valid arguments, and that have premises that we know to be true. And look, our purple moon argument isn't known, has false premises. The number of hairs argument isn't known because even if the premises are true, they're not reasonable to believe. And the UMBC argument isn't known because even though those premises are reasonable to believe, they're not true. And there's this little chart here that has 3 of the components of knowledge. Most epistemologists think you need more than this to get knowledge. But again, knowledge means that if you know something is true, it is true and it's reasonable for you to believe it. So it's going to have at least those 2 components. And that's kind of what's important for our purposes today. So here's a big chart, and don't get too freaked out because this is actually just summarizing everything that we've already talked about. So basically, look, there's 2 ways that arguments can be good, and I've labeled these as subjectively good and objectively good. I've noticed that people sometimes use subjectively good or like the word subjective to just mean a negative thing, like it's just your opinion, but you don't have evidence for it. That's not what we mean at all here. What we mean is that you have evidence for it, but that doesn't always guarantee that it's going to be true. So it's subjective in that, like, from your perspective, it's very well evidentially supported, but that could be separable from the way that the world actually is. We had a lot of evidence that Virginia was going to beat UMBC, but it turned out that UMBC ended up winning. So that's subjectively good. Then objectively good is just about the way the world is. Are the premises true or not? And so we can have arguments that are subjectively good because the premises are rational to believe, and subjectively not good because it has at least one premise that's not rational to believe. And then we can have arguments that are objectively good because they're sound, they have true premises. And then we can have arguments that are not objectively good because they have at least one false premise. And then that kind of leads us to our chart. So if an argument is both not strong, there's a premise that's not rational to believe, and not sound, it's going to be a pretty bad argument, but it could still be valid. So like our purple moon argument would be an example of that. And you could have an example that has premises that are rational to believe, but the premises are false. So this would be our UMBC basketball tournament argument where we have this unprecedented upset. Then you can have arguments that have premises that aren't rational to believe, but those premises could be true. This would be like the even number of hairs on my head example. And then you can have arguments that have premises that are both rational to believe and true. And that's going to be known arguments. Known arguments are going to be both strong and sound. So hopefully that kind of sums up what we've talked about so far in a helpful way. So this brings us to lesson 4, which is that known arguments, like I just said, have premises that are both true and rational to believe. Note that this isn't all you need to know a premise. To know a premise is true, you also need to believe it. And then there's this more complicated 4th condition, which is kind of roughly like the idea that luck can't be involved. In that video about knowledge that I talked about, if you're interested in that, you can look at that. But it's really hard to spell out exactly what that 4th condition is. But one way to think about it is that it can't just be true by luck. So this is what's called the Gettier problem, how to define knowledge. But at the very least, knowledge requires, if you know a premise is true, it is true, and it's rational for you to believe it. Okay, here's the problem with known arguments. It's a different kind of problem. And that's that knowledge is a very high bar. So we can have lots and lots of evidence for something, like tons of evidence, overwhelming evidence for something, but we can fail to know it if we just got unlucky and it turns out that it's false. And so part of me wants to say, yeah, let's aim to know that our premises are true, but we can't always know. And sometimes we just have to do the best with the evidence that we have. And so strong arguments, even if they're not known arguments, they should still change our opinions because our evidence just isn't perfect. It's rarely, if ever, totally perfect. Again, even the idea that there's a microphone right here and there's a table right here, those could be false if I'm brain in a vat or if, I'm dreaming right now. And of course, that's very unlikely, but we can't rule out even, those very far-fetched possibilities. So even my evidence, there's a table right here, isn't perfect. And so I do think the problem with known arguments is just that it's a really high bar and it's going to be hard to always know that premises are true. So here's another way to kind of sum up what we've talked about and think about this picture. There's this bar represents different levels of goodness that an argument can have. And then when we have an argument, we can think about, well, which bar does this argument meet? And here's a little cheat sheet in reverse order. So starting at the bottom. So the argument could be valid. That means if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. That's our first step. That's kind of our first bar that the argument would need to clear. And then, our next two, one isn't clearly better than the other. One kind of represents objective goodness, one kind of represents subjective goodness, but I put them in that order for a certain reason. I'm going to talk about what the yellow line means in 1 second. So the next bar that the argument would clear is that it has true premises. So that would mean it's a sound argument. Then a strong argument. So that means it's valid with premises that are rational to believe. And, it could be strong but not sound. It could be sound but not strong. The reason I put strong there, again, I'm going to explain in a second. And then the highest bar is that it's valid with premises that we know to be true. So that's maybe the best kind of argument. And the reason I put strong above sound, even though you can mix and match the two, is because the arguments that fall above the yellow line are arguments that give us a reason to believe their conclusion. We can have an argument with true premises again, but that we have no evidence for, and so that won't give us a reason to believe our conclusion. But if an argument is strong or an argument is known, then they give us a good reason to believe the conclusion. And so that's kind of why I put that yellow line there. Those arguments above there give us a reason to believe their conclusion. Okay. So what we have covered today, we've talked about 3 kinds of good arguments: sound arguments that are objectively good, strong arguments that are subjectively good, and known arguments that are both objectively and subjectively good. And then we've talked about 4 lessons. 1, sound arguments don't always give us a reason to believe their conclusions if they're just true by luck. Then we talked about the lottery paradox. So for an argument to be strong, it must be reasonable for us to believe all the premises together, not just each premise individually. The third lesson is that strong arguments can have false premises and false conclusions. And the 4th lesson is that known arguments have premises that are both true and rational to believe. And again, knowledge requires more than just truth and rationality. It's a little complicated, everything that it requires. But at the very least, known arguments are going to be both objectively and subjectively good in the sense that we've been talking about. And a good bit of this material was taken from Feldman's Reason and Argument, Chapter 4.